Great. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to convene the Board of Selectmen meeting, and then John Higley's going to convene the Planning Board, and then Addie's going to introduce the main events. So the Board of Selectmen are in session now.
And I'm John Higley, Chairman of the Planning Board, and I'll just read our agenda. Our agenda is, tonight is a joint meeting with the Selectmen to hear the presentation on the Housing Production Plan from the Housing Partnership Committee and consultant Jennifer Goldson, and to consider vote in support of the plan. And I want to thank, I really want to thank the Housing Production Partnership Committee and the Selectmen and my fellow Planning Board members and all of you. A lot of public input has gone into this, so I really want to thank you for that. So the Planning Board meeting is in session.
All right, JV formalities. I'm Addie Mae Weiss, and I am on the Housing Partnership Committee, and it's been a great committee of some great members, but as John Higley said, we couldn't have done this plan without all the input from the community, and we thank you for your continued support. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Goldson from JM Goldson Consulting, and she's going to present this final draft plan. So.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Jen Goldson. I'm a planning consultant that the town hired back in November, I guess it was, to help them put together a housing production plan. I'm going to talk about a little bit about what a housing production plan is, and then I'll talk to you about what's in the draft plan for the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board to consider. But first, I just wanted to see how many of you were part of this process. I recognize a lot of the faces here, either through the interviews or coming to the workshop or coming to other meetings. All right, so I feel like about 75% of the room has probably participated in some aspect of this process. So when I go through some of the definitions, you all that have been part of this process are going to know those pretty well already. But I'd like to do it anyway for the benefit of the folks who weren't as involved. Maybe this is your first meeting about it, and also for the benefit of the folks watching on TV. But I'll move through that part of it fairly quickly so that we can get into what is really in the plan. And so I will start out by just reviewing the project schedule and showing that we're at the very end of the project schedule. I'll define what do we mean when we use the terms affordable housing and housing production plan, because they both have very particular meanings in the context of this planning work. I'll talk a little bit, very, very briefly, about housing needs, but I'm not going to get into a lot of data and a lot of statistics. We have a lot of information in the draft plan, which I think there might be at least one copy left over there, and I think you can also get it online. And then I'm going to talk mostly, I'm going to spend most of the evening talking about the goals that are in the plan and where they came from, and the strategies that are in the plan. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the action plan, which is trying to outlay who does these things and when. And then at the end, and I actually didn't add this onto my talking points here, but I also have a couple slides, one or two slides, I can't remember, on the process. What happens after the plan is adopted by the town? Then what happens? And how does, there are going to be terms like approval and certification and safe harbor. I'm going to talk about all that at the very end. So in terms of the schedule, we started in early December with a kickoff meeting with the Housing Partnership. And I know that this is very small. You don't need to read it. I'm going to give you the highlights. And the Housing Partnership was kind enough to take me around town. I was not familiar with Sherborn at all. In fact, when a member of the Housing Partnership called me to say, do I do this kind of work, I wasn't even quite sure where Sherborn was, I'll be honest with you, even though I only live about 20 miles from here. So I learned a lot on that tour, and I learned a lot from the Housing Partnership. And then the next thing we did, and the date is on there somewhere, I think it was in February 6th, we conducted a day of interviews where we had people coming in from different groups, different board of town officials, and folks involved with the schools, and we tried to hit a variety of types of people who are involved in the community, including realtors and a developer too. And we did a day of interviews where we really talked about, well, what's your perception on housing issues in the community? And what do you think about, different areas of the community that you may like to see or not like to see have housing developed? So we talked a lot about that. And then when was it? It was March 7th, we held the public forum. And we had a very big turnout. Even, you're a small town, but even for big towns, that was a big turnout. So I was very impressed with the community and how much you care about these issues. And you'll see a little picture of that. The folks that came to that will remember that we did a bunch of small group exercises and you got to talk with people in the community about their feelings. And then from that, we drafted the plan. And a lot of the ideas that you'll hear me present that are in the draft plan came from the community feedback through the interviews and the public forum. And so actually I should go over the end of the schedule. So we're towards the end of the schedule. We're meeting tonight with the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board. And the next step is if the Planning Board and Board of Selectmen vote to adopt, doesn't have to happen tonight, but at some point we hope that they'll vote to adopt the plan either in its current form or in an amended form from what it is now. Then I'll prepare the final plan, and the town will then submit to the state for approval. And I'm going to go through that process more precisely, but that's where we are in this project timeline. So just as a reminder, these are some of the same slides I presented at the public forum. What is Chapter 40B? Just raise your hand if you feel like you kind of know what Chapter 40B is. So almost everyone. So this is how I define 40B. It's a state statute that sets an affordable housing goal for the state, for every community in the state. And what it says is that the state would like to see 10% of every community's housing stock be affordable. And I'm going to say what I mean by that word affordable. It is a very precise definition. So what happens if your town hasn't met the 10%? And most communities in Massachusetts have not, including Sherborn. So what that means is that the town is subject to comprehensive permits. They can be submitted, and a developer can ask for waivers to override the zoning and also streamline the permitting process. That's really what it means. But I just want you to know that, maybe it's just academic for you to know, but even after you reach the 10%, developers can still submit comprehensive permits, and sometimes that can be helpful to the community if you have restrictive zoning and you want to see certain types of developments still happen. So just so you know, comprehensive permits can happen in any community, but there's less flexibility to deny them when you don't have the 10% of your housing stock as affordable. So I want to define the term subsidized housing inventory. On some of the slides, I may have called it SHI. And so if you see the term SHI, you'll know that it means subsidized housing inventory. And all that really means is it's a list that the state keeps to figure out if a community's met the 10% requirement for affordable housing or not. There are 4 things that make a unit eligible for that list. You don't need to remember these all, but just so you know, they need to be either subsidized or created through a local initiative, like your zoning bylaw. They need to be affordable to households with low or moderate income, and I'm going to tell you what that means exactly. They need to be affirmatively and fairly marketed, so you can't have, let's say, apartment in your garage and rent it to your mother-in-law. She happens to have low and moderate income. If you didn't go through an affirmative, fairly marketed process saying this unit is open to everyone, and we're going to go through some type of fair selection process, usually it's a lottery, so that everybody has an equal chance. That's all that 3rd one means. And then 4, it needs to be subject to a long-term affordability restriction. So just because it might be affordable today, if it's not affordable tomorrow in the next 30 years, then it doesn't count. So the minimum term is 30-year term for a unit to count on the subsidized housing inventory. There's one exception to that, and not to confuse the matter, But if you have a unit that's created through a rehab program, the restriction can be 15 years. But usually it's 30 years or more. And often communities want to see restrictions in perpetuity, especially when they invest local dollars and time in creating those units. And so your subsidized housing inventory in Sherborn is at 2.3%, and you have 34 units at Leland Drive and, Leland Farms, which is on Leland Drive, and Woodhaven. And then just a few more slides about this. Does anybody have any questions so far? You can feel free to interrupt me if I'm saying stuff that doesn't make sense.
What state agency monitors all this?
It's called the, people call it DHCD. It's the Department of Housing and Community Development. And that's the agency that will be submitting, or the town will be submitting the plan to, by the way. And so I told you I'd tell you what low and moderate household means, what that term means. And this is what it means in your area. So in every metropolitan area, there's a different income threshold. And the income thresholds depend on household size. So if you see the little people on the bottom, you'll see that on the left there's one person. So a person who lives alone, if they have an annual income, gross income of $51,150 or less, that would be considered a low or moderate income household. If it's a four-person household on the right-hand side, and the household makes $73,000 or less, $73,550, then that would be considered a low or moderate income household. Now, sometimes people say, well, does that mean 2 adults and 2 kids, or 1 adult and 3 kids, or 3 adults? It doesn't matter. It's just 4 people. It doesn't matter their ages, or how many of them are working. But you put all the incomes together out of those 4 people, and if it's $73,050 or less, then that's considered low income. And I put a little bit more information in this slide. The way they calculate it is it's 80%. They look at the metropolitan area. And your metropolitan area, you're in the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy. It's a huge metropolitan area. It has over 100 municipalities in it. And they just do a calculation. The federal government does it. It's 80% of the area median. And that's how they get those figures.
Is it 80% of what you have there, or?
This is the 80%. This is the calculations already done here.
How often do they update the numbers?
Every year. And in fact, these are the FY17 numbers, so these were fairly new. All right, so now I'm going to talk a bit about what a housing production plan is, because there are different types of housing plans. And this particular kind of housing plan has some regulatory authority if you meet certain conditions, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. A housing production plan must have certain things in order for the state to recognize it as a housing production plan. It needs to have a housing needs assessment, so we look at lots of data about who lives in the community, who lives in the region, what kind of housing stock is in the community, how many affordable units do they have, and we look at who's spending more money than they should be in the community on housing costs. We call that being housing cost burden if you spend too much of your paycheck toward housing. We look at all these different things, and I'm going to talk to you about just a few of them that I picked out to talk about tonight. And then we come up with a whole section, it's like, 40, 50 pages long, this first bullet on just housing needs. And it's a lot of data, you don't need to remember all the data, but the conclusions is what I'll go over in a couple of slides. And then the second thing we're required to have is goals and strategies that show how the community eventually, not necessarily this year or next year, or even in the 5-year timeline of this plan, but eventually it shows how you'll meet that 10%. And showing incremental production. And I'll talk a little bit more about what is incremental production when I get towards the end of the presentation, when I talk about certification and your numerical goal. So I'm going to talk about goals that are both qualitative and a numerical goal that shows how you're going to eventually achieve that 10%. And then it also has to have a 5-year action plan saying, okay, so you've listed out these strategies. Over the next 5 years, When are you going to adopt these strategies, and who's going to be responsible for doing that? Now, I want you also to know that even though a town adopts a plan like this and the state approves it, there's nothing holding anybody's feet to the fire if these strategies and goals are not met in those 5 years. It's really an incentive-based plan. So instead of a stick-based plan, it's a carrot-based plan. So if you have this plan in place, then you're able to have something called safe harbor or certification. And I'm going to talk more about that. Some communities I work for don't care a lick about safe harbor because that's not the primary motivation. In this community, I think you might care about safe harbor. So I wanted to spend some time talking about what results this plan could have for the community, but I'll do that towards the end. So the things, those 3 bullets are the things that we're required to put in. And then the things in the purple box are things that you also can put in if the community wants, but you don't have to. And you'll see that we did put some of this in. So you are also allowed to look at providing housing for middle-income households, not just the low-income households, but households with a higher income. And you can also look at providing direct assistance. I'm trying to remember, I don't think we have anything about direct assistance in your plan, at least in the way it's proposed now, but you could in theory create like a local rental voucher program or a home buyer program. That would be considered local assistance, but it wouldn't necessarily create units that count on the subsidized housing inventory. It can, depending on the type of program, but that's just so you know. You have some flexibility with that. And then the third thing is you can also say, we really just want to have more diverse housing options. In addition to trying to meet this 10% requirement incrementally over time, we just want to see if we can have more diverse housing options. And so we did talk about that. So some of the strategies you'll see talk about that. It doesn't necessarily create more affordable housing that counts on the SHI. I can use the jargon now since I defined it, subsidized housing inventory. But you can have strategies like that and goals like that. Any questions so far? Okay. Was that mostly stuff you know or remember me saying last time? Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk, I shouldn't have walked away so fast. So now we're going to talk about housing needs. And before I get into the needs and a little bit of the data, I'm going to say that we've recognized from learning about the community that the community is quite unique. And what we planners, you don't have to agree with this term, but what we planners call your kind of community is a country suburb. So you're not really, really rural, but you're not really like a bedroom community suburb like you think of other communities. You're sort of this mixture. You're a suburb, but you're very country. And so you have this, and that is actually the source of some of the tension that I think I've felt in the community. I'll talk a little bit about that. You're the smallest community in terms of population in the immediate region. And you really have done a lot to preserve both historical and your agricultural heritage. And you still have many working farms. It's clear that you value, from the interviews in particular that we did and reading through the general plan and the open space plan, it's clear that you do value the exceptional scenic views, open space, and natural resources, and the ability that residents here have to really access those resources. We heard a lot about the importance of recreation trails and getting out in the open, and that seems to be a big reason why many of the people we talked to decided to live here. And then we've also recognized from the turnout at the public forum to even the turnout tonight, this is pretty special. Usually when we get to this stage of the plan, even if we had a really good turnout at the public forum, people are like, yeah, I know about that already. And we might get a couple people in the audience. So you should be, I'm impressed with you. And then we also know that you've been able to do a lot in this community with very little, what I would view as very little staff support. You've been able to build affordable housing, and you have been extremely active and forward-thinking in that way. So one thing we did recognize, and we were told over and over in the beginning, and then we saw it for ourselves. I'm not royal or anything. I just I have a team of people that I work with, so we all sort of talk about what are we observing about this community. And so one of the things we observed, and we were told right from the very beginning, is that there's this divergent vision of where the town should go in the future. And I think that that's been a source of tension for a long time in the community. You can raise your hand if you think I'm overstating it. Or understating it, I don't know. But what we've seen is that there's, maybe it's not black and white, but there's definitely a group of folks in the town who want to see, in particular, growth in the town center, and both to support economic goals as well as to just create a more vibrant town center for the community to benefit from. And then there's another school of thought in the town that feels like, well, if new growth happens at all, we don't want anything to change about the town center or the places we kind of frequent. We don't mind going out of town for most of our services. But if new growth happens at all, let's put it on the periphery where we can connect to other communities' infrastructure and where it won't really feel like as much of an impact in the middle of the community. So I don't know if I'm stating that the way you would or the way you would frame it, but that's what I heard. And I wanted to recognize that we've tried to think through that tension, and you'll see in the strategies, we try to touch on a little bit of both. We don't tell you to go one way or the other, but we have a little bit of both. And I would say in some ways we ended up favoring a little bit more the A point of view over the B, but it's not exclusive by any means. And I'll talk through that when I talk about the goals and strategies. Anybody want to tell me I'm crazy when I talk about this divergent vision or anything? Okay. All right, so the other challenges, and this we see in a lot of communities we work in, but preserving the rural and scenic beauty is important, and thinking about housing growth and how do you preserve the rural and scenic beauty, what housing types, for instance, and a lot of that gets back to design and density to some extent, but I would argue it's more about design than density. Environmental constraints, you rely on private wells and private septic systems. And then you have very high land values and extremely high property taxes, which I probably don't have to tell most of you about. All right, so here's one of the few slides I'm going to talk about statistics. So you have a low diversity of housing choice. What I mean by that is that your housing stock is primarily single family. There's very little rental stock in the community. And there's few alternatives to single family. And when I say alternatives, I'm talking about townhouses, duplexes, accessory apartments, or apartments in small multifamily, for instance. Out of the renters that you do have, most of them are seniors. It's about 60% of all the people who rent units in this town are over age 65. It's also important to note that most of the renters in the community have low income. Their incomes are less than $50,000. And then the other thing that's important to know is that out of the low-income renters, most of them are spending more than half of their income on housing costs. So that's what we call severely cost burden. As a housing planner, we look at a benchmark of, are you spending 30% or more of your income as spending too much? In our mind, that means you're spending too much of your income on housing costs. You don't have enough income for other things. And we look at that, I want to be very clear, if you're a billionaire, we don't really care if you're spending 50% of your income. It doesn't matter as much. But if you're low income, low or moderate income, it really does matter. Because if you just look at the math and how much is left over, you don't have an awful lot to spend on things like food, transportation, healthcare, going out to restaurants in the community, spending local dollars to support the community. So we look at how many people are spending too much. And in this particular slide, I brought out the renter figure because you're going to hear me talk about the need for rental housing. I wanted to give some numbers around what you have now. So right now you have the top, I actually have a pointer in my pocket. So the top line right there is how many year-round household homes you have now. And so there's 1,479 year-round homes. And that's actually, I should clarify, it's not now, it's based on the 2010 census, just so you know. That's how the state looks at it, it's every 10 years they look. Then here, the 189 is showing how many low and moderate income households are living in Sherborn now, and they're spending, this one is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, so we call that cost burden. So there's about 189 low and moderate income households spending too much on housing costs living here today. And then the next one, this one, is how many low and moderate households are there in total? This is an estimate, but it's estimated at 250 households. And so that's quite a big proportion of those low and moderate income households spending too much on housing costs. And then the last one is, the 34 is how many affordable units you have now. That's Woodhaven and Leland Farms. And then the gray, the 114, is how many more you would need to get to the 10%. And sometimes I make the point that, sometimes you hear planners, I don't know if you've heard this, but I certainly have heard it a lot, that planners say, well, even though you get to your 10%, you still have a housing need. And that's what they're looking at. They're looking at, well, you have 250 households who are lower moderate income locally living here. I'm not just looking at the region, looking at in Sherborn. And 189 of them should be in a cheaper house, basically, is what that means. And you're only looking to create another 114 units. So that's not going to help support the whole need that you have. So I just wanted to point that out. Any questions so far?
The 10% is state mandated. Is that a fixed target or a moving target?
It's a moving target. So let me say that it's a goal. It's not mandated. It's a goal with a stick. And so the stick is that you're subject to comprehensive permits. And the zoning board has less flexibility to deny those than if they were over 10%. And so the moving target part is that when the next U.S. Census comes out in 2020, well, you won't get the results a little bit later than that, it's likely that if your household number goes up, the number of year-round homes rather goes up, then the 10% goes up. It's just a percentage, so yeah. So by the time that happens, you'll be nearing the end of this 5-year plan, and you'll probably want to look to redo this plan anyway around that time, and so you'll want to think about how that number has changed. And so the other reason, I've talked a lot about the state's goal of 10% and the housing need and things, but I also want to emphasize that we as planners, and I think some of you think the same thing, think that housing diversity and having a more inclusive community actually makes the community stronger. And one of the things that we heard in our interviews in particular was this community's changed a lot, and it's not as diverse economically or socially as it was when I was growing up 50 years ago, or 80 years or whatever, I don't remember exactly when. But so the community has changed, and so I always like to talk a little bit more positively too. We're not trying to say that you have all these needs and all these dire things, but it's actually can be good for your community to think about more housing diversity and having a more inclusive community. All right, and so the bottom line, and you can read the details in the report if you want to, if you're the kind of person that really likes to dig into the data, because I really just glossed over it tonight. But there are 3 takeaways that we'd like you to walk away from this meeting with. One is that we think you just need a more diverse housing stock, whether you're creating affordable housing or just more options to single family on a large lot, choice. And so we think that that could be small multifamily homes. We think that it could also be barrier-free housing to help accessibility needs, particularly with an aging population. We think also that you could have more housing opportunities or options at all market levels. So what we heard from realtors and folks that have lived here is that they feel like as they age, they either need to figure out how to stay in their house or they need to move out of town. And I know there's Abbey Road, Abbey Road, and there's maybe some options, but not very many options for people who would like to age in the community but may not be able to or want to age in their home. So that's what this at all market level thing means. We think you do need affordable options, but we also just think you need more options for people. The other thing is the rental piece. We do think that this community could benefit from more rental options. You have some provisions for accessory apartments, but it's very restrictive right now. You have some provisions for creating multifamily, but we want to talk a little bit about how you might think about broadening those options. And we do think we said up to 80% of the area median income. So when we look at your housing needs and what kind of affordability needs you have, we look at whether you need very deep affordability, which we would consider extremely low at like 30% of the area median income, or if you really need more like the 80%, which is the top income that could count as low income and still get you units on your SHI. And then we also looked at middle income housing, and we think you really need to focus on both the 80% area median income housing that's affordable at that level. So that's the slide, if you remember, I showed the pictures of the one-person household, that's that slide. But we also see a need for middle income housing that would be up to 100% of the area median income. And then we also think it's not as great a need, but we think you could also benefit from more homeownership opportunities, including small cottage style in cluster developments, maybe looking at shared septic systems and open space surrounding. So you have some provisions for open space residential development, which it's called in your bylaw, but we want to talk about a little bit of a different model in the strategies. It's called natural resources protection zoning. And then we also see, you could do some affordable condos or condominiums, whether they're affordable or not, and then townhomes. And those were the types of homeownership opportunities that we thought you could pursue. But again, I wanted to emphasize that 1 and 2, this is somewhat in order. More housing options in general, and then rental housing is the most important thing. And so in talking about goals and strategies, the way we came up with the goals is we looked very carefully at the general plan draft, and we took those draft goals to the public forum. And if you remember, when you first walked in, there was a open house portion where you looked at posters and you dot voted and made comments on the goals. Those were the goals from the general plan. And for the most part, you affirmed those goals. And so what we have here is goal number 1 is to manage and guide residential development, to maximize local control, minimize adverse impact, and to incrementally achieve the state's 10% as opposed to all at once, but over time. And then there are 2 subparts. So A is provide more affordable housing options for the low and moderate income level. And then B is to also provide middle income households with affordable options. And then down here is where we get at that numerical goal that I mentioned before. This is a requirement. We essentially have to put either this or something higher in. This is sort of the minimum that we need to put into the plan. And that is that you'll strive, note that it's not, definitive, I'm going to do this for sure, but you're going to strive to create a minimum of 7 homes annually that count on the subsidized housing inventory. And then we just did a calculation. If you did about 7 units every year, how long would it take you to reach that 10%? And so it would take you to 2034. Now you could do more than that, but that would be the minimum numerical goal. And you might ask, well, what happens if we don't do that 1 year in this plan? I'll talk a little bit about that. Like I said before, though, this is not a plan that offers punishments. It's a plan that offers incentives. So there's an incentive if you do this. There's really nothing different than what you have now if you don't meet that goal. So the next goal is increasing, and we tried to choose these words carefully in the general plan as well, increase appropriately scaled housing options, recognizing the nature of the existing residential development in this community. We wanted to make sure that scale was something that was highlighted in this goal. And so we did add in this goal, increase residential options in town center and enable more diverse residential options throughout Sherborn. And you'll see that some of the strategies deal with both of those two aspects in different ways. This illustration is something that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council did about almost 10 years ago now, but it was some visioning for, well, what could development that is appropriately scaled in the town center look like? Okay, and then goal number 3, and this is the last goal, so we tried to keep it pretty simple. There's 3 goals. Ensure residential development respects the semi-rural character and environmental health in the community. And so this is just an illustration. I don't really need to show you how beautiful your community is, but this is recognizing that the type of development and the placement of development and how the developments deal with having low impact or no impact on environmental features is important. All right, and so now we have 2 slides on strategies. And I'm not going to get into detail on these, but I wanted to talk a little bit about each one. The strategies are broken out into 2 categories. The first one is a local initiative. And what I mean by that is things you can do with local money, local land resources, and time, volunteer time, staff time. So it has nothing to do with regulations. And then the next category that I'll talk about in the next slide is regulatory, and that has to do more with zoning for the most part. So the first one is to, just like you did for Leland Farms or Woodhaven, is to do another development. Foster, I call that locally initiated development, by offering town-owned or acquired property for appropriate development. And the reason that doing local initiative projects is often an attractive option for communities is that the community then has a lot of control over what does it look like, how is it sited, what is the density, and what type of housing. Do we want to do congregate living or group homes, or do we want to do some other type of development? And you also have control. Because you are offering town-owned land, you don't necessarily have to sell the land to a developer. You could offer a long-term lease, a ground lease, where the town maintains, I think you did that for Leland Farms as well. So the town always owns the land, so you never have to worry about the units not being affordable for some reason down the road, because the town still owns the land, even though it doesn't own the buildings. Does that make sense to folks in terms of local control? Okay. And so in the plan, when you read it, how many people have seen the plan before tonight and have gotten a chance to look through it? So most of you. So I do think it's online for those of you who haven't, and I think I see one more copy over there if you want to walk out of the meeting with a copy. But in this strategy, you'll see it's kind of a beefy. These strategies are much beefier than they look on this slide. But we talk about one potential town-owned property, and that's the caustic land to explore. We recognize that there may be some development constraints, but to look at that as a possibility. And there may be other opportunities that come up down the line that you're not aware of yet. That you could look at. The second strategy here is really one to weigh the pros and cons of establishing a local trust. And you can do a housing trust. So a housing trust is an entity kind of like the housing partnership, except they have money, more money than you might have. That's really the biggest difference. And the money is taken out, if it's a municipal trust, the money's taken out of the general fund and put in a special trust just for housing. If it's a nonprofit trust, then it's not a government trust. It's a private nonprofit, just like the, what is it called, the Sherborn Rural Land Foundation. It'd be like that, but for housing. Yes?
When we were building Leland Farms, we created the Sherborn Community Housing Corporation.
So that's a nonprofit.
It was a nonprofit, and we also got at least 2 acts of the legislature that exempted it from prevailing wage and competitive bidding to do municipal the Leland Farms project on public land. So we already
Was it,
have the vehicle.
was the mission specific to Leland Farms, or is it broad enough that it could be used for other other local initiatives? I'm just curious, but that's good to know.
I think it's broad enough because we had two acts of the legislature, but we also created the corporation. And the corporation wasn't limited at all. The legislation was targeted to specific parcels, but there is an already created nonprofit corporation appointed by the.
Okay, that's great. So this strategy might be better off looking at the corporation that exists and how it can be utilized. So we can talk through that. And certainly we can make this language in that strategy broad enough that it would allow you to consider using the existing corporation for this purpose. And so this type of, no matter if it's a municipal trust or the existing housing corporation or another nonprofit, this particular strategy can be very helpful to implement the first strategy because they would have the ability to hold real estate, and they would also have the ability to accept private donations, for example, and they could work with an entity like the Sherborn Rural Land Foundation in conjunction. So I'll talk about that a little bit too. Okay, so the third one is about town center. So encouraging new homes and mixed-use buildings in your town center area with the creation of a well-defined downtown water district, which I know you've been talking about for a very long time, it's not a new idea, and or town center sewer infrastructure. And I know that this is a complicated issue. We go into it a little bit more in the document, and I know that probably some of you are much more familiar with what the town has already been doing than I am, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but that did make it into the plan as a strategy to look at going forward with those ideas. And then the fourth one is, and this is not mutually exclusive from the first one, by the way, the foster locally initiated development and the foster public-private conservation-based development. Those could also work hand in hand. And so we look toward what other communities are doing. I worked on the Vineyard over the past year, and the Martha's Vineyard Land Bank has been very active in working with nonprofit housing groups and the housing trusts, municipal housing trusts on the island, in when they're putting together conservation deals to protect large swaths of open space, they ask these nonprofit housing groups or municipal trusts, do you have any interest in a piece of this property for housing? And if you do, then why don't we work together and designate a portion of this for housing development, cluster style maybe, cottage style in a sort of an open space design, and we'll deal with the conservation part, and then this portion can be designated for housing. And so I don't know what opportunities there might be in the future, but the idea is to make that connection. And so the blue one, this one about an entity to do these kinds of things, and then this third one about working with the Sherborn Rural Land Foundation. Those are all connected in my mind. Okay, and then the next one is foster regional cooperation. So this is where we're trying to get a little bit at both of those viewpoints. We have something about town center, but we also included this one about the peripheries of town. So foster regional cooperation to extend public water and sewer from neighboring towns to support specific town-approved affordable housing developments. So it's just a very general statement that says you want to work to bring infrastructure to these properties that may be next to other towns that already have infrastructure. And then the last one under local initiative is work cooperatively with development entities to help shape and anticipate proposals for development that would best align with this plan and the general plan. So it's really keeping this plan in mind and keeping your general plan in mind when you're looking toward what new developments could be out there. So any questions on the local initiatives before I move into the regulatory ideas?
So these came out of the discussion groups. So,
Yeah, well, let me back up. I proposed these ideas, and then people weighed in on them. Yeah, and I think we dropped some ideas, but I don't remember offhand which ones we dropped.
so was there any specificity around the second to last one? I know why it would be good for us, but I'm trying to understand why it would be good for the neighboring communities.
Uh-huh.
What's the question?
Why would, the second to
On the
last
second-
one...
on the second one, I mean, obviously, it'd be good for us, but why would...
Second to last.
Second to last, why would Framingham or Ashland or Natick be interested in doing that?
Well, I guess I can't speak for them.
So, Laura,
Yeah,
They could sell water, yeah.
Make money,
Yeah.
they get customers.
And there's precedent in the, is it called Sunshine? What is the senior
Yes.
development on the corner? Yeah,
Sherborn Meadows.
Sherborn Meadows. Is that Framingham
Yeah.
that
yes.
connected in, yeah?
But it wasn't put in for that purpose.
What's that?
It was not put in
Oh,
for
there you
that
are.
purpose, however.
Oh, is that right? What
It-
purpose was it
It
for?
was put in the 1930s.
Oh, is that right?
It was a land deal of
Yeah.
some sort between the owner of that.
And then they just
bigger piece of
capitalized on
property.
the fact that it was there.
Right.
Okay, so we have 4 regulatory strategies in the draft. And one is looking at the town center area again. But of course, the sewer and water infrastructure would need to be addressed first. If those can be addressed, then we're saying explore zoning amendments to allow mixed use and small scale multifamily, it should say housing, to encourage development of new homes and mixed-use buildings in the town center area. The second one is looking at the EA, which is the Elderly Affordable District. It's an overlay that town meeting can vote to put on when requested, and you've done that, I think, twice? Is that right, Gino? Abbey, 4 times. So Abbey Road, and there was something that, and the one that we just talked about,
Leland Farms.
and Leland Farms?
Sherborn Meadows.
And Sherborn Meadows, the one we just talked about, yeah. And so there's some confusion in the bylaw, the way it's written, as to whether it allows both elderly housing and affordable, or one or the other. And so just clearing that language up would be helpful, so that you can have both, maybe elderly and affordable, in the same development without question. And also, we think that you can look to incorporate as a density bonus, saying, well, if you could give us a few, let's say you're proposing an elderly development. Well, and you're not proposing an affordable development, and you can get a certain density for that, a certain number of units. Well, if we let you have another 3 or 4 or 5 units, you can think about the right formula. We'd like you to give us, for that density bonus, though we'd like some affordable units out of that. So it's not all high-end luxury senior housing or market rate housing. And so it's just a voluntary incentive. It's not a mandate. And so we thought you could think about adding that in to the elderly affordable while you're looking to also clarify that. Does that make sense to folks? Okay.
It does, but you need to have the economics behind it to figure out
You-
the incentive.
That's right. So we didn't specifically say what the density bonus should be. You really do need to look at that very carefully. There are a lot of inclusionary zoning bylaws and bonuses like that on the books across the state, probably the country too, that don't really work because the financial incentive isn't great enough. Okay, so the next one is, we think your accessory apartment bylaw is overly restrictive. And we think that you could consider some revisions to make it more flexible. We also think, because we recognize that people are nervous about, well, what would that look like if we had accessory apartments that were easier to create? We think that you should consider adopting design guidelines so that you can look at, well, what does that look like? Where is the entrance to the apartment? Does the house still look just like a single family, just like it did before? Where is the parking for this? Can it be tucked away? Can we look at the site planning on this? And so we know that preserving the single-family character of the neighborhoods where accessory apartments may go is important to this community, but also to, honestly, to every community that we've worked with. And so we think that you can be very careful about that while also making the bylaw more flexible. Right now, you're not allowed to charge rent, and I think when you sell the property, the unit has to go away. So that's pretty restrictive. We don't think you need these units to count on your SHI. I'm trying to remember, and I'm sorry if I'm getting my communities mixed up. Is there an affordable provision in this bylaw? Yeah. We think that that's probably not necessary. If somebody is renting an apartment in their basement or even in their garage, is something else to think about. Can you let outbuildings be converted? They probably should just have control over who rents that and not have to go through a whole process of affirmative fair marking and lottery. I mean, who's going to really do that anyway? So we think that just having that housing option available is creating a unit that's more affordable than the units you have now.
But it won't count for your subsidized.
But this idea would not count for your subsidized housing inventory. Yes?
Just to your point, that provision has been in place for about 30 years and nobody's ever used it.
Okay, that's good to know. Does everybody hear that? Yeah, okay.
The other thing is it doesn't count, but it generates income that might allow somebody to stay in their house.
That's right. And this is very helpful, especially to senior households. It not only can generate income, but it can provide an opportunity for a caregiver to live in the unit, for example.
You already have that.
Yeah, but I mean, not an official caregiver. But sometimes they could select tenants who are willing to help out with like mowing the lawn or doing some things for like a reduction in their rent. And other times we find that the senior moves into the apartment and rents out the big house. So they're still in their property, but they're not, they're actually making even more on the big house rental. Okay, and then the last thing is consider, we propose this, oh yes.
I have a question, louder. A thought, what we were just talking about before, how I know people chuckled a bit, in 30 years no one's used it, but maybe that's the problem with the town, that people don't know that that's there. And so how do we market that better, or let people know those options, that option is out there, especially in this new century, and where the town could use something like this?
Yeah, some communities...
Chuckle to a...
Sure, some communities are very proactive about letting folks know that this option exists. Some communities, well, Barnstable is one I can think of, does have an affordable component to their accessory bylaw. It's kind of complicated the way they get those units to count. They do mini 40Bs for every apartment, if you can imagine that. But they offer money. They have Community Preservation Act, but they offer money to help create these affordable accessory apartments. So they offer money to help the physical building needs to create those units. And they do promote that program. But, that's something to think about. I think that's an anomaly. It's working in that it's created, I can't remember how many, but I would say dozens of units for them that count on the SHI. But I also know from working on their housing plan that it's been kind of a nightmare to administer and to monitor. And so every year they have to follow up on, are the people renting these apartments actually still low income? And they have to try and get verification of income every year, which is a lot of back and forth, and it's a lot of administrative work that they feel like it's probably not worth it, but yeah.
Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that,
But then it's a headache.
yeah, it's an example, right, and I think in a community that's as small as Sherborn is, with such, you really don't have a lot of staff support, I would advise against creating anything that's going to be a lot of administrative work. And that's another reason that I say to just scrap the affordability component and let accessible apartments be a little easier to create that are just market rate apartments, but with design controls and trying to really think through, well, what do those look like and what is the impact on the neighborhood? All right, and now the last one is consider adopting what's called, and this is just a term that came out in the last, I don't know, within the last 10 years, I guess. It's called the Natural Resources Protection Zoning. It's kind of like the open space zoning that you already have, except instead of requiring a special permit for open space zoning where you are by right for a regular conventional subdivision that, you know, has lots spread out all over the property, this would create the cluster, grouping the homes together and preserving more open space as the by right option, because that's usually what a town would prefer to see. And the conventional subdivision would still be allowed, but you'd actually have to go to get a special permit for that, because it's the one you don't really want people to do as much. You'd rather see more open space preserved, and this is also a way to get some of those cottage units that I was talking about. Now, people might say, well, what about the septic requirements? And yeah, that is a concern. I know that you can do, and I'm not a technology expert, so don't ask me any hard questions on this, but I know that you can do clustered or shared systems in order to cluster these, especially when you have a large swath of open land around it.
Would you do a yield plan, or would you?
So they don't do a yield plan, so that's the other thing. In the open space residential, you have to create the plan as if you're doing the conventional, and then create another plan for what you really want to do, which is the cluster. In this one, there's a formula that they use that you just have to create one plan, so it simplifies it in that way too. Okay, so those are the regulatory strategies. Any other questions on those before I get into the action plan?
Well, I have a
Yes.
regulatory action plan, which is to require for a subdivision of more than 5 houses that 20% be anything above it, be using the Concord or Cambridge formula.
Affordable.
20% be affordable or cash equivalent, would then go to
Yep.
our corporation or to an affordable housing trust. Because we don't have one in the general fund. We don't have a community preservation. So there is no funding in the general fund to put into
Right.
any. And if you don't have it, then you gotta get it from the private sector. And the way to get it from the
Right.
private sector is to require a contribution for larger developments.
So, I don't know if everybody heard that, but the idea is to create what's called an inclusionary zoning bylaw that would mandate that any development, could be even a subdivision of over a certain number, and you'd have to choose what that number is, would have to have a certain percentage of those units be affordable or put a cash payment to the town, so the town can then put it into one of its local initiatives to create affordable housing. A lot of communities have this kind of program, or this kind of regulation, I should say. And we can certainly put in there, so this is something in your deliberations you should think about, Planning Board and Board of Selectmen, if you'd like me to include an inclusionary zoning, the way I would word it is consider the pros and cons and look at what kind of formula would be most effective. A lot of these bylaws don't work well. But there are consultants out there who understand the economics of it better than I do, actually, I'll be honest. I wouldn't write that kind of bylaw, but if you get the right consideration, it's possible that it could work. I just don't know in your market if it would work or not. But, so that's something I think before you vote to approve the plan, you should consider, do we like the strategies that are in there, and do we want anything else, like, should we be adding consideration of an inclusionary zoning bylaw in addition to what we've recommended? Is that fair? Okay. All right, so this is the action plan we came up with, and I know you probably can't read that, but it's just to give you a sense of what it looks like. On the left, it lists those 10 strategies that I just presented. And if you end up wanting to add in a strategy like the inclusionary zoning, we would add that to this list. And what it has is, in the middle, it has FY18, FY19, out through FY22. So it's the 5 years of the plan. And it's trying to show what what you would focus on in which year. And our methodology when we look at this is, we don't want to give you too much to focus on in the first year. We want to spread it out a little bit. And we also want to think about what needs to come before something else. So for example, when we look at the town center and the infrastructure, well, that would need to come before the zoning changes. So you can see, I'll give you that example. Where is it? Hold on a second. Here it is. Okay, so 3 is the infrastructure for town center. We say, take the next 3 years. It's not an easy thing to do. I know you've already been working on it, but take the next 3 years and really focus in on that. And then later, right here, hopefully after you've been successful at that, focus on what kind of zoning could we create to further mixed use or small multifamily in that area. And so the light, you'll see some fields just have a light blue all throughout. That means it's just continual. It says opportunities come up. It's something that is you're probably going to be working on it every year, and it's opportunistic. And so I don't want to go through every single one. I mostly just want you to know that that's in there. And that's part of your deliberations for the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board. Do you think we got that right when you look at the plan? And then the other piece of this is who's responsible in the town, and then who is a supporting responsible entity in the town. And we focused on in the town because this is a town plan. So there could be other entities that get involved. Like the Rural Land Foundation might be involved in something, but they're not a town entity, so we don't put them as a responsible town entity in the plan. And so you'll see, for example, that for the first one, the local initiative one, we say that the housing partnership, or if there's a trust or the nonprofit corporation would be involved, but you'd also want a town entity who's involved in those local initiatives. And then town meeting would need to be involved if there's land disposition. And then we also have the Board of Selectmen. This cut off a little bit, but the BOS there is Board of Selectmen. So you'll see that where there's town meeting involvement needed, we list that. Where there's Board of Selectmen involvement needed, we list that. If we got something wrong, you should tell us. If we missed out on somebody, you should tell us. Here we have foster regional cooperation to extend public water and sewer from neighboring towns. We gave that to the town administrator, who was here a little while ago. And then we put Board of Selectmen as the supporting entity. If you think we should flip that, we can, or if you think we should put something else in there. So this is something that I guess, in your deliberations, I just don't want you to overlook, because we're hoping that this will be a good roadmap for you as you're going through trying to implement the plan. Any questions on that? Yes?
Yeah, I understand that you don't want to fill in all the dark blue squares right in year one because
Yeah.
The state won't believe it.
Well, and it's overwhelming for you.
Right, but there are certain things that the planning board has been talking about for a couple of years, such as what you're calling natural resources protection zoning.
Yeah.
We call low impact development.
Yep.
There are other names for it.
Yeah.
Cluster housing, open space development. And I think, to be honest, we like to be moving on that much before FY 2020, and the same for accessory apartments. That was also discussed.
So thank you for bringing that up. And so when the Board of Selectmen and Planning Board consider this, I would like you to take those types of things into account. If there are things that you're already working on that you feel like you can really focus on in the next 2 years, we should move those up. But I would also want to see us maybe adjust other things, because I do want to be careful. I don't want to give you everything to do in year one. I do want to try to spread it out a little bit. And not that you're going to have, be able to really even adhere to this whole thing, but I want to make it plausible that you could. So if we're moving things up, I'd like to see maybe pushing other things around a little bit. Yes?
What's the test of whether or not we strove?
There is no test. The only thing, and when I get into certification, actually that's the next slide. Let me go there and I'll tell you what happens. So, yes?
Strategies. 30 years ago, the town turned down a Community Preservation Act. Is that
Yeah.
a good thing for us to consider now? I know that little state money.
I know it came up, and it seemed like it was not something that the community was interested in pursuing. And I can't remember if we proposed it in the town forum or not. Do you remember if I added it in there? I think we ended up not.
I don't think we did. I think it was too many unknowns as to why, but we were still working through whether it was supported or
Yeah.
not.
So we didn't put it in. I would love to. I love CPA. I've spent a long time working with CPA for the city of Newton. And when I started my consulting practice, I was consulting with almost exclusively CPA communities, helping them figure out how to use their money. But that is something that if the planning board or board of selectmen in their deliberations want to add in, I think that it's something that you could think about.
What is the matching?
Well, it's gone down, although the good news is that I think it's the Senate just put in their budget, I don't really know exactly what it was, that they want to increase the fees at the Registry of Deed. They want to double them, so that's how the state match is determined, and so that would give everybody a bigger match.
So what's the matching today?
Oh, gosh, is it around 15%? Does anybody know offhand?
Between 15 and 20, yeah.
Yeah, between 15 and 20, and it depends on if you're adopted at 3%, which is the max, or lower. If you're adopted at the maximum percentage, then you get more of a match in the formula. And so let me get to your question. So this is what happens next. At some point, and it doesn't have to be tonight, although it can, the planning board and the board of selectmen considers and votes to adopt either this version of the plan or another version that you'd like us to revise. Then I'll make it final and adopt anything they say. We'll adopt it as long as you put in inclusionary zoning or CPA. And then the town will submit that plan to DHCD, the State Department of Housing and Community Development, and they'll say, is this a complete plan that you can approve? And I want you to know that I've already sent it to the state in the form it's in. I always do that because I just want to make sure they think it's a complete plan in its current form. Even though it might change after tonight, that's fine. But Phil DiMartino from DHC already has a copy of this plan, and I said, this is what we've done so far. Does it look complete to you? I always like to give him a head start so that he doesn't need to take the time that he's allowed to take. And I'm going to talk about that now. So the planning board, board of selectmen vote, and then the town sends the adopted plan to the state. Number 3 is the state has up to 30 days to determine if it's a complete plan or not. If it's not a complete plan, meaning it doesn't have all the things we needed to have, remember the slide of the needs and the must-haves and the can-haves? If it doesn't have all those things in it, then they're going to send it back and say, not complete, we can't approve it. They have 30 days from after you vote and submit it to determine that. And then, once you submit a complete plan, they have up to 90 days to say that they approve it. Now, in my experience, they've never taken that long. In fact, I've gotten the approvals within a few weeks of submitting. And because we give them, as a practice, I give the plan to them early so they can tell me if it's complete. And it also gives them a head start on reading it because it's a pretty lengthy plan. They've never taken 30 days to determine if it's complete. They've taken maybe a couple weeks. And they've never taken 90 days to approve it, but they can. They have that right to do that. Then they issue a letter saying the plan is approved. And what that does is nothing, really. All it does is allow you then, after you have an approved plan, to what they call produce units. What it means for you is that you get units on the subsidized housing inventory. If you get 7 of them on in 1 calendar year, then you get what's known as safe harbor. And so this is where the incentive comes to play. There's really no disincentive. If you don't look like you're striving, nothing's going to happen other than what's happening now, which is you're subject to comprehensive permits. If you create those 7 units in 1 calendar year, and what I mean by create is if the zoning board approves a 40B, for example, and it has at least 7 units that count on the SHI, when they submit their decision to approve that 40B to the town clerk will stamp it in on a certain date. That's the date those units count on the SHI. Then they're going to say, DHC, nothing's going to happen unless you ask for it. The town will then ask. It'll say, we just approved 7 units that will count on the subsidized housing inventory, or more units. Will you please tell us if our plan is now certified. And DHCD, as long as you really do have 7 units that count on the SHI in that one calendar year, then they'll issue a letter saying, yes, we agree, you've met your production goal, your incremental production goal, and we will certify your plan. And that gives you safe harbor for 1 year. What safe harbor means is that the Zoning Board of Appeals has more authority to deny or put additional conditions that they normally wouldn't be able to put on of 40B without the threat of appeal. It doesn't mean you won't get any more 40Bs. If you do get comprehensive permit applications, you still have to take them the same way you do now. You have to open the public hearing, you have to follow all the minimum requirements for holding that public hearing, and you still have to vote to approve or disapprove. Okay, and then the other number I want you to know is if in 1 year you approve 14 units that count on the SHI, then you get a 2-year safe harbor. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do the rounding. Yeah, so it must have come out as a decimal. So if it's 15 units, then you get certification for 2 years. And the zoning board has that additional authority to deny or put additional conditions for up to 2 years. Now, in theory, you could stay in safe harbor all the time if you actually did that incremental production and timed it. You might have a day or so overlap. It'd be pretty tricky to do it seamlessly. But in theory, you could be certified the whole length of the plan, potentially, but that's very unlikely, and most communities are certified here or there in the 5 years that they have the plan. So that's everything on that list. Any questions about, yeah?
So for a 5-year plan on bullet point 5, what's the maximum number of units in the, go on the qualifying spending? How far out?
Well, there's not really a maximum. I mean, you need 114 to get to the 10%.
So let's assume 77 units get approved in the first year. Those will be applied over 5 years?
No, oh, no, I'm sorry. They are applied to the certification when they count on the SHI, and they count on the SHI when the zoning board submits. Right, and they can't pre-approve something, saying next year we're going to approve another.
2 years is the longest time you can get safe harbor.
That's
No matter
correct.
how long it takes.
That's right. Yes, that's right, yes.
If you're going through all the work of getting a plan, it seems to me more economical in people's time and effort to, say, have a scheme for 35 units all at one time, rather than do all the work for 7 units now, next year do all the work for 7 more units, and so on.
You could certainly do more units. The longest safe harbor you can get, even if you did the 35 units, would still be the 2 years. But you often can't control how many units you end up getting. The other thing I want you to know is that it doesn't matter if you create those units through the strategies we've recommended here or some other way, like a 40B that's out there, for example. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is that you create either a minimum of 7 units or the 14 units. But it doesn't have to be through the means that we're suggesting in this plan. Yes?
A few years ago, the town, in its wisdom, built Woodhaven. Took a couple of years to get the financing through the town meeting at a time when interest rates were double digit. But we did it. And it appears as though that has served us very well today. It's 24 to 34 units there at Woodhaven.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to take that asset and leverage it for more affordable units? Could we take Woodhaven as an entity, which is generating surplus revenues over its expenses, close to that, and put that into some sort of an affordable housing trust, which then could be used to borrow against to build more affordable units and maybe replicate Woodhaven?
Well, that's an interesting idea, and because Woodhaven's not run by a housing authority, you don't
No.
have any of the
Town.
restrictions.
It's
Right.
It's not a public housing authority.
Something to look into. It sounds more like a legal question to me, but I think it would be worth exploring. I didn't realize that they were operating with a surplus.
Well, I don't know, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I mean, it's generated.
Okay.
Is it operating with surplus?
Yes.
Yeah, they've had,
It's
from
full.
what I understand, they've added money to their revolving fund.
The rents have been stepped up, and there's a waiting list. So there's a need for housing like that.
They've been using a lot of that surplus money to renovate the units, so
I
they charge
understand
higher
that.
rents, so they're growing the asset.
Okay,
But
great.
that'll be paid off, that money that they borrowed to do that will be paid off soon, I think. But then any more
Yes.
surplus could be used.
Just answer the
Yes.
fundamental question. It is counterproductive to try and borrow money on the basis of Woodhaven. In order to borrow money, you couldn't sell a bond like that. You have to pledge the full faith and credit of the town. So if the town wanted to borrow the money, internally, we can account for it by saying we're going to use revenues from that source or some other source. But it makes no sense to transfer that asset away from
Oh,
the
I see what
town
you're saying.
to an affordable housing trust or to a private organization for them to borrow money. Those bonds aren't sellable. They won't work in the marketplace. Instead, if we want to borrow money, the town of Sherborn has got a good bond rating, and we can borrow money. And we can fund the bond, if you want, from the proceeds
Okay.
I see.
of Woodhaven.
All right, well, however you want to do it, but it's an asset that you could leverage and use the proceeds of Woodhaven to invest in more affordable units. And getting right back to Robert Johnson's point, maybe that would result in a clump of 30 or 25 more units, which might serve us meeting our 7 units a year for the next 5 years.
And the other thing to say about that amount is it's very hard to make a feasible development for 7 units or 14. So it's more likely you're going to see like 30 to 40 units needed to put the money together and the subsidies. Yeah?
I have a question about the safe harbor timeframe. The ZBA approval goes to town clerk, and that triggers a retroactive certification of your housing production plan. So on what date does the 1 year or 2 year clock start?
The day that the units count on the subsidized housing inventory, which for 40B is the day the zoning board submits the written decision to the town clerk.
Okay, so that's the same day.
Yep.
as it's certified.
Mhm.
Town could expand by adding another building, but also expand Leland Farms by adding more units. We have Woodhaven's a rental project, and Leland Farms is a ownership condominium.
Can people hear it back there?
No.
So he's saying you could
Add more
potentially
units.
add more units to the existing Woodhaven or Leland Farm development.
There may be limitations on the site, but
So that was my whole presentation, and I know that these are official meetings of the planning board and the board of selectmen. I don't know if you wanted to entertain any deliberations tonight, or if you wanted to hold your discussion to another meeting, but that was my whole presentation. I'm happy to take more questions if you want. I have 2 in the back, yes.
This is a general question. I was struck in reading the report about the longer-term projection for Sherborn, like in 2030, along with Holliston and Medfield, I believe, down in population, let's say 10%. And there wasn't much explanation as to what the methodology for those predictions, but I assume it has to do with the fact that since we are country rural, to use the new term, we're not smart towns, and young people aren't attracted there. So what's your understanding of the methodology behind those projections?
I think that's part of it. It's based on projections from the Mass Donahue Institute at UMass Amherst, and you can get them online if you just Google UMass Donahue projections. And I do think they look at trends like that, because you'll see that Natick and Ashland and some of the other communities are growing, and what's the difference between crossing over the border. So I guess My own feeling is, I know that those are based on methodologies that are relatively complex, but at the same time, I think they are more of an art than a science, and I don't really think in the next, 20, 30 or so, I don't think we really know what's going to happen. And I think some of it has to do with what kind of housing you have in the community by then, and what kind of community this is by then as well. Yes?
Is there an advantage to building rental units as opposed to owned units?
Yes, the rental units are needed in the region, but also in your community. You have very few rental units. I don't remember the number offhand, but most of your stock is ownership. So it's a way to give people another option that's more affordable than owning a home. It's also a way to give seniors in particular more options. Doesn't have maintenance requirements, doesn't have any long-term commitments. And in general, rental housing helps the economy of the region. And so when we find communities with very low rental, we look at not just your local needs, but also your regional needs. And the state is trying very hard, as you might know, to encourage more rental throughout the state. And so we look at that aspect and how it helps workers be able to locate near job centers and things like that as well. So I would say in any community that has mostly ownership stock, we also find that it's a barrier to fair housing. I haven't mentioned fair housing much, but this metropolitan area is highly segregated. It has a lot to do with federal policies from the New Deal and beyond that, that created redlining and racially restrictive covenants, which if you looked at deeds back from the 30s and 40s, my guess is a lot of the homes in Sherborn and these other suburbs that are mostly white communities now had racially restrictive covenants, which said you can't sell to African American or you're actually going to go to jail. So when you look at things like that and fair housing, we also look at the need for rental to try to help desegregate the region. Sometimes people don't want to hear about that, but it is an important thing to think about. There's a big wealth gap between racial minorities and white population. There's also, and when I say wealth gap, I'm talking about income as well as assets. And so rental housing is a way to really help the mobility in the region so that hopefully someday we won't be quite as segregated. But that's my spiel. I'm actually about to do a fair housing training. I'm developing a module around this for planning boards and zoning boards and Board of Selectmen about how local town policies help to perpetuate the segregation in the region. But that's a long answer to your question. It's not an easy one to answer straightforward because it's very complicated, but or many facets to it. Some people really care about the economics. Some people really care about the fair housing. Other people care about, well, who's in our community that could benefit from rental housing? It's a more affordable option in general. So those are all the answers. I hope I hit something that was meaningful to you. I don't recall offhand. That could be right. Okay, yeah. Good. Yeah. Hold on.
Another big advantage to the rental is, if you do have an affordable rental, development with 25% rental units affordable. The entire.
That's right.
Every unit is considered.
That's right.
SHI.
That's right. So if you have a rental 40B and every unit in that.
It doesn't have to be a 40B.
Yeah, as long as it meets the requirements, that at least 25% are affordable. Then even though the other 75% could be potentially luxury rental units, they'd all count towards your subsidized housing inventory because the state is trying very hard to encourage the development of rental housing. So they give that as an incentive to allow more rental developments. Yes, and then you. Yeah.
Back to your previous slide.
Yep.
So if we submit this and it's approved, and as you know, there's a number of 40Bs at various stages. And
yes.
And one of them is approved by the DPA with 14 units.
Yeah.
then we get 2 years of safe harbor, that this boils down to.
If the timing is right, yeah.
And does that safe harbor apply to pending applications as well?
No, unless the public hearing was open less than 15 days before you're certified. So here's the timing, and I can talk to folks more offline if they want to get into the details. So I think they're trying to figure out if the timing would work for anything. So here's the way it could happen. And I'm just going to throw out some fake dates. I'm just going to throw out some fake dates just by way of giving you an example. I want to make sure he's listening. So. Okay, I'm talking to you. Okay, so here's how it's going to happen. Let's say you approve tonight, and I turn it around in a week. And so let's say on June 1st, you have a plan that's ready to submit. Just for the sake of giving you a date, you don't have to approve it tonight. June 1st, I give you all a plan that's ready to submit, and you submit it that day. Let's say it's a complete plan. I think it will be, but let's just say it is. And within a few weeks, DHCD says, yeah, we agree on June 1st, you submitted a complete plan, we're going to approve it. Now, this is something important for you to know when the timing is tricky. They don't approve it on the date that they send the letter. They approve it retroactively to the date you submitted a complete plan. So if I submit, or you submit to them, a complete plan on June 1st, and they issue a letter on, let's say, July 1st, saying it's approved, they actually say in the letter, it's approved as of June 1st, because that's the day you submitted the complete plan. Now that's important because, let's say on June 2nd, the zoning board writes their decision on some 40B that's at least 14 units on the SHI, and they give it to the town clerk on June 2nd. Even though you don't have that letter from DHCD yet, you're not going to get it till July sometime, it's going to say you had a complete plan on June 1st. So that ZBA decision that's been given to the clerk on June 2nd will get you the certification. Now, what happens to the things in the pipeline is that when you know you're certified, and this is the tricky part, you have 15 days from when the Zoning Board of Appeals opens the public hearing to give notice to the applicant that you believe you have met a minimum of showing local progress by having your housing production plan certified. But you have to, the ZBA has to tell them within 15 days of opening, whenever that public hearing was open, there's 15 days. And I actually can't remember right now if it's calendar or business days. It's probably calendar days. And if you can't tell them that within the 15 days, then the whole thing just goes on as if you're not certified. If you can tell them that within the 15 days, then you still need to go through the whole process and at some point close the public hearing, and at some point the ZBA will need to take a vote. They can still vote to approve or they can deny. So that doesn't change, but if they decide to deny, they can say, we're denying because we believe, as we told you 15 days before within 15 days of opening this public hearing, we believe we have met the statutory minimum because we're showing local production and we're certified. Does that answer the question okay? Okay. Anybody else have a question on that? Yeah, or anything else? Yeah, it's okay.
When you talked about diversity of housing stock and getting more rentals, you look at the economics of the demand for rental units and how much Sherborn is not transferring.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did not do a demand study. It's different than a needs study. In a needs study, we really look at who's spending too much money, and we look at what kind of units would they need. So you have a lot of seniors living alone that are, most of your renters are actually seniors with low incomes. And so that's part of what we look at. But we don't look at demand. That would be a different consultant. Sorry, but it's true. Yeah.
In your example, the fictitious timeline, you submitted a complete plan, it's good, everything's complete, but before they approved it, they wanted to see an amendment or a change, something like that.
The state?
Yeah.
So the only change, well, they would only say that we don't think it's complete. They don't say we don't like goal number 3.
But there's another approval happening, right?
Yeah, so first they have to say it's complete, and then they say they approve it. And the approval is retroactive to when they agree they have a complete plan from you. I have never had a plan not approved that I've done, but I've heard of them not approved, and I've heard it's because they don't have the minimum production goal in there that we have, saying at least 7 units. Other towns, it's a scarier number, so they were more reluctant, I guess, to put that number in, and they didn't get approved.
But it's complete plan and very likely.
Pretty much, as long as they agree that we have the needs assessment, we have goals and strategies, and that it's plausible that through the strategies, you could get to 10% eventually. That's kind of hard to prove, but assuming you adopt all the strategies, you could potentially create 114 units over, what did I say, 12 years or something, or no, it was more than that. Yeah, exactly. Any other questions? Yes?
What happens in year 5, when your plan is certified?
So when you have a plan for 5 years, and if you don't have a plan update, then you basically don't have an approved plan anymore, and you're back to where you were before you created the plan. So what communities try to do is they try to get the plan updated before it's expired, and then they always have an approved plan in place. Yeah.
I didn't read the action plan in detail. There's no line in there that says update.
No, actually, I should add that in. I never think of doing that. That's a good idea. Yes.
Is that a way to ensure that the town's housing production committee stays active?
Yeah, and it's also, the data changes and your needs, in theory, will change. Also, the census number, as the gentleman, I think he left, but somebody asked, is this a moving target? The answer is yes, and after the 2020 census, your year-round households are going to change, so you're going to need to adjust those numbers for that reason. And also, by 5 years, hopefully you've adopted some of these things. You can take them out of your strategies and maybe think of new strategies. Anything else? So I'm not sure, did you have one more?
No, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, thank you. So I'm not sure how the Board of Selectmen and Planning Board want to handle the rest of the night, but if you need me, I'll be in the corner. Okay.
Well, from the planning board point of view, I think there's a few things that we should consider. And I would say they are to edit the language that exists regarding inclusionary zoning. One idea is on page 14 of the plan, just simplify it so it just says inclusionary zoning. You don't be specific about density bonus or other details. It just says consider inclusionary zoning.
One of the advantages of inclusionary zoning is that when you get to the 10-year mark and you have to recount, even adding units all the way along the way, you got a moving target. But if you require these additions to your housing count to also include affordable units, then you're staying the same as opposed to being further behind.
Yeah, I get it. In fact, when we talked about this in the past, in the strategy 8, it says inclusionary zoning density bonus. We were too specific. I think the intention was to include inclusionary zoning as a strategy in its plan, to consider inclusionary zoning, but we made it too specific.
Well, if you make it mandatory and you don't have a bonus or some other incentive, then you are exposed to taking some challenges and litigation. So just because Concord has it and they've been able to somehow implement it doesn't mean that some developers will not challenge it because...
They'll go after Concord.
Well, not if their land's in Sherborn. Yeah. I mean, that's, so consider is the right way to put it, without the details, but I do think we're probably ultimately in a better position if we have some kind of incentive in there and make it voluntary.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So we can say, one of the things that was said was make it 20% or more than the
Oh, yeah. That was the beauty of the Concord thing. People were looking at 10%, and 10% only keeps you exactly where you are.
Right.
But 20% actually allows you to make a dent.
If you can get someone to do it.
But if you get them to cash out too, then you've got money, because where's the money going to come from to expand Woodhaven, for
I think
example?
as a planning board, though, we were hesitant, but we've talked a lot about this in the planning board since the fall, and the concern was the economic challenge of how do you write it in such a way that it doesn't backfire and never get, it just seems that there's more communities that it doesn't really work, and it's something to, again, add it as a strategy to consider, and maybe we can find more assistance for the economic calculations to find a way that it maybe could work. It's been more effective in a multifamily housing situation than in a single-family housing situation when we explored it, so.
Well, that's why you pick a number. I mentioned 5, then you go into a mandatory contribution, but you may want 10, 15, or 20. So if you have a large tract of land that comes available in the town, and there are some large tracts, and there's 30 houses that are being built, if you don't have any protection at all, you add 30 houses, then your 10% has gone up by 3, and you've got no affordable housing to show for that.
In the next recalculation. So I think in terms of the plan language, I think simplifying it, making sure it says consider and simplify it, so it just says consider inclusionary zoning. And I think the plan is okay as it's written, and we'll work out the details.
We'll have 2 little, just some typos in there. They're not really typos, but there's a statement that Ward Parks is under the jurisdiction of the Board of Selectmen, but in fact, we conveyed that to the Conservation Commission. So if you look in the Registry of Deeds, you'll see that some years ago, we did a swap with them to get more land over at Leland Farms, not Leland Farms, over at the playing fields. Laurel Farm Fields. Yeah. So we had the Conservation Commission give us some land, additional land for playing fields, at the playing fields, and in return, we gave them Ward Parks. This says that Ward Park is in the jurisdiction of the Board of Selectmen.
So Eddie, was there a discussion at all about Board of Health regulations or consideration of that as an action item, a way to address constraints on affordable housing development that relate to our Board of Health regulations?
To the extent that it's mentioned that we'd like to look at the encouragement of being able to possibly have shared septic systems in an overview without, all of these have been general strategies, so within the strategies, some of them, in order for them to be undertaken, it will require Board of Health action.
But I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, for the action plan, we've got nothing, we've got the Board of Health doing nothing, and maybe that's intentional, but it seems to me that a large amount of the limitations in our town is driven by our on-site water and on-site septic, and to the extent there are ways to make practical changes that are environmentally sound, that allow us to facilitate housing, that probably should be an action item.
Jennifer, I think I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the way the housing, there's certain things that are written in a housing production plan a certain way, and there were certain things that we talked about and felt were important, but it was recommended that the housing production plan might not be the appropriate place for that. And right now the discussion is about a recommendation for the Board of Health to make certain changes to enable certain.
No, it was to review, to consider, review
the community,
septic and on-site water local regulations for obstacles to the creation of affordable housing.
Yeah, you can put that in a housing production plan.
I guess.
But, I mean, I think if we put things in, at some point, somebody's going to go down the list to determine our strive rate, rating, and they're going to say, did you do this, did you do this? So the more we put in, the more we're going to be on the hook.
But
we're on the hook for building 7 units a year.
We already voted.
Yeah, but we're also on the hook for keeping up the plan.
We already voted to do a mounting study, to provide the funding for that. So that's already being done. There is going to be a mounting study. It may very well be, at the end of the mounting study, it says, don't do mounds. which point you don't go
I'm not
anywhere.
disagreeing with the concept of reviewing it. Believe me, I'm all for that. I'm just saying, the more you put in here, the more you have to do.
Yeah, I guess that when we talked about this specific topic, I felt comfortable having it in the general plan language, but not in this plan, because I think if there is a review, if it is considered, and it does have some impact, it's to do the things that are in the plan already. It's to acquire land or do things that are in the plan already. So whether you can do it or not relative to the current regulations, or if they're possibly changed in the future, we're still trying to figure out what we can do with land.
So I think that takes the pressure off in an area that the town needs to be a little bit more focused on, what it can do to facilitate this kind of development.
Yeah, well, you're right, but we do have that, we have language that I think is pretty good in the general plan.
All right, but we're talking about the housing plan.
We're talking about the housing plan, but
I think it's relevant to the housing plan, and
it's relevant.
you know, the key metric is going to be production, how many units you produce. I don't think that the agency goes through this action plan and ticks off.
So-
Well, that's true, but if I could just clarify, they do occasionally send around a form saying, how much have you done? And most communities don't respond to the form for whatever reason. I'm not saying they're being belligerent, but they ask. But it's not like they're judging necessarily. It's not tied to funding or anything like that.
I just think I think it's a worthy goal, and as Paul properly points out, the mounting study and review, I think, would be consistent with meeting that goal in the action plan.
So for example, these affordable housing units, the accessory units rather, the idea of having an accessory unit or allowing a senior who has a house that's too big for them, but maybe they could rent it and live in, a unit that's created in the barn. The biggest initial limitation on that is, can I expand my septic system to do that? Well, we have certain rules about what you can and can't do to expand the septic system to add, to add additional rooms, for example. You might have the ability to do it safely, but if you need variances or the like, you might not have the right to get those. And so this is all part and parcel of implementing these strategies. I just think we have blinders on if we ignore that whole aspect of what makes Sherborn a very difficult town to do development.
What I was going to suggest is that we take the very general language we have in the general plan that addresses just exactly that and apply it in the housing production plan.
I think it makes sense.
Language.
Yeah.
We have the language that we're
Right.
comfortable with, so let's...
But I would do it as an action, as one of these action items, the list of items with a responsibility on it, and have it be something that, on the action plan strategies, have it be something that the town is saying, this is something we would like to see happen in order to address this problem we have, which is we're vulnerable to affordable housing development, and responsible entity would presumably be Board of Health and maybe, I don't know, town meeting or something, but...
I think the language was something to the effect that it was pretty non-committal, but it gets to your point. Explore like best available technologies.
That's all you can do.
Evolving technology, because we don't know.
That's right.
Yeah, these should be general. I think incorporating that language in this production plan makes great sense.
Well, we have the language, so the question is, does it, we've talked about it in the past, does it belong in the housing production plan or not? And
I think they're getting a sense that we think it does.
yeah. So one clarification that comes up is it's not, Board of Health is not zoning. It's, but it certainly has an impact on what can be done in town. So the action that's already been funded to evaluate mounted systems is already, that action is already funded, so.
So when we get credit for it. So when someone calls up and says,
Yeah, I mean, that's
what have you done?
part of the problem.
We've done
I mean, I don't know if the resistance here is political or what the resistance is. I don't understand why it's...
in the general plan.
Yeah, I don't understand why it's hard to put it in here, but...
No, I think it was one of those, because of the fact that the Board of Health regulations seem to have been I guess there's no harm in putting it in as a strategy for exploring, and it's been talked about a lot.
I think it's in the language, if you look at it sideways. So, to be specific with it, it's fine with me. Yeah, I mean.
It's in there, it's in there.
We have the language that's in the strategies now. Consider adopting, we have natural resource protection, we have revised the accessory apartment bylaw, and consider revisions to allow more flexibility in the guidelines. So, let's say the actions that might result from a change would be directly impacted by it. So, I think it's just insert the language there. Okay.
So I'd like to add the idea of reviving the Sherborn Housing, considering, having somebody consider reviving the Sherborn Housing Corporation.
So the question is, does that need to be in this language? Does it require an edit to this plan?
Well, we have, one of the slides there said.
Jennifer's got it. Right here, I think.
I think you can add it into number 2, which was about the trust, but I think you can also say explore this existing entity, reviving
The existing
that.
entity is defunct now. It would need to be revived, and I guess I don't know if there's an advantage to reviving it and creating a new board, or if it would be better to start with a vehicle that makes sense for now.
So I think that's the strategy, answering those questions.
Paul's going to say that there's special act legislation that might be helpful, but I think we learned that that was confined to Woodhaven and Hill.
But it's first of all, getting a exemption from prevailing wage
Pretty much impossible, right?
is virtually impossible. But we have it for Leland Farms and Woodhaven. That's why I had suggested one thing you consider is if you're going to do 7 units a year, adding 3 units to Woodhaven and maybe 4 units to Leland Farms, where you've got an exemption already statutorily that you can do it bypassing a
I'm not
lot
sure
of...
with Leland as a condo that you can do that as easily as you might be able to if that legislation is confined to the property, but that's detail stuff. That's not something we need to solve.
Would be a long-term thing relative to the...
Yeah, that's something we could push out to 2020 or something.
So-
Get you some blocks on the right side of the...
So the language that we have says, consider the costs and benefits of creating a private, local, nonprofit, or municipal housing trust. So is that language...
Or reviving the Sherborn Housing Corporation.
I'm opposed to the housing trust because all the studies that have been done of Sherborn indicate that there are too many independent agencies running around. There's too many independent elected officials. There's too many boards and committees. The housing trust is an autonomous organization that would then go in the wrong direction for what we've been told Sherborn ought to be going for. And the other problem I have with it is, it's fine if you're a community preservation act town, so you have a funding source that goes to it, but we have no funding source for it. So you're going to have a group of people there with no money. And I understand the suggestion that we take money from the general fund. Well, taking money from the general fund means going to town meeting and saying, let's appropriate $100,000 to an unspecified purpose for an unspecified project to go to an independent board who's going to spend it without ever telling the town.
So you don't like trust?
It's just not what this community is about. They like to know what the project is, review it, have a PowerPoint presentation, be able to ask why is there 2 windows instead of 3, all that kind of stuff.
I got PowerPoints. Okay, so the language though, it says, so we should say, creating a private, local, nonprofit, or municipal, this is all considered, or municipal housing trust, or reviving a community housing corporation.
The Sherborn.
The community. Reviving.
It did a great job with Leland Farms.
The community.
And Woodhaven.
Housing corporation.
But that would be an independent entity. There would need to be a board appointed, it would be independent. that's fine, but it's,
Yeah, with independent trustees.
well, yeah.
I thought we revived it in order to,
We revived it in order.
for the
in
sole
order to kill
purpose
it.
to,
Well,
yeah.
But if Paul's got a reason to revive it, we could
Yeah.
try to revive it again.
No, I was talking about the revival that you found a couple of years
Yeah.
ago that was just for a limited one-year period and for a very limited
So the
purpose.
selectmen could appoint the trustee, remember? They didn't give
Right.
us something.
But to be clear, to get the 2 years, we need 14 units, so not 7 and 7. Right, so
Correct.
14 out of the gate,
15.
15.
Who's counting?
But if we did 7 one year and 7 the next year, we'd get a year each time, so the idea.
No,
Need 7 and 8.
Yeah, it's just a rounding.
Because it goes up? Is that what-
No, it's
It would be
7 and
7
7.
and
Yeah, it's 7 and 7. It's just the rounding. If you, it's not, it's like 7.2 or something.
But then, the next
this is what I
census is
just
going to
asked.
change anything.
Let me ask you
I
something
thought we
about,
needed 15 right away. Is it really, we can do 7
You could do 7.
in the first 12 months?
Yeah.
And then another 7 gets us another 12
Yes.
months?
Yes, that's
But
correct.
if it's ownership units and it's 25% affordable, then you're adding 28 houses. It depends on what kind of units, if you're adding rentals or if you're
and then you
adding.
need another couple, you know.
So it's not just building 7, those are 7 SHI units.
Right.
So Jennifer, I had a question before when you were going through the numbers. So we've got Whitney Farms and it does have some units built. It has no affordable units, is that right? So aren't they required, I forget the permit, but wouldn't they be required to include an affordable unit within their first
I
4 or 5?
didn't look at the way you approved it, if you have conditions about phasing.
I believe at least one is built. I don't believe that it's been marketed.
But we had a building permit for it to be an affordable unit?
Yes.
So why does that
That
money
counts for it. We haven't submitted it to be.
included in the inventory?
Right.
Because they haven't said they want anybody to live in it yet? Is that the idea? or-
Well, just because it's only one unit, it doesn't really help us at this point unless, we're better off actually to hold off.
Right.
When we have others to lump it in, to make it count as one of our seven.
Except, can I just say?
It's already been built, you
I
can't do
think
that.
those units counted when they were first approved.
And then they went away.
They won't
And
count
they-
towards the safe
Right,
harbor.
you can't double count it. So once they were on the SHI originally, if they got taken off.
I
then
don't
you-
think they were ever on the SHI.
Okay, well then that's different.
But they still wouldn't count
As
towards safe
approved
harbor,
they
right?
were,
Because
right?
that would only count. at
We briefly had another X number of units
She
as
provided the
approved.
inventory.
My understanding is they wouldn't
It wasn't
count if they
on the
were
list.
already on it. But if they were never on
Right,
it.
I don't think it was ever on the list. In fact, they said the list every 2 years.
Even though it was an approved 40B,
Right.
that they could have built out in 2008 or whatever.
Right.
I can check, just, to see. I don't know how often that happens.
Because then otherwise,
But we ought to be at least getting credit for them when they are built,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I think there's one built. I guess the question is, it doesn't sound like it would help us for the 7, but we ought to at least get credit for it if it's built and.
Well, if
Yeah.
they're building them, why can't we get credit for all of them, even though they're not built?
Well,
Because you
they,
got all the approvals.
the time,
They took so long.
yeah, it took too long. When was it approved? It was years ago.
2005, but there was
Yeah.
some litigation that went on until 2012 or 11 maybe, but yeah.
Yeah.
So they go on, but then they come off if no building permit is issued
Right.
within a certain period of
But
time.
now they are slowly building some of them, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I understand that if they go back on, we don't get to count them towards our safe harbor. They count as SHI.
They go to the SHI count, they don't go to the safe
I
harbor
think that's what we're
count.
being told, yeah.
That's
Right.
correct, if they were already on. But if it was never on, I have to check. I'll ask, I'll call Margot Leclerc, do you know her? She basically handles the list, the SHI list at DHCD.
So can I also ask you to consider expanding Woodhead and expanding Leland Farms? Because if you put like a second floor on a Woodhead building, and put in another couple of units there,
We do that without the first floor collapsing. And is it built for that?
I'm saying consider.
Yes.
Have an
I
engineer
would
take
want
a
to do
look.
it if it was going to
What
collapse.
can you do?
Where's Sean when we need him?
Or put it, put a lean-to against the existing building.
Cantilever over the top of the building.
But there's a reason Sean's not here, he can't build one here.
Exactly.
We couldn't be considering it.
But it's ideal to to capitalize on what we have. And if we have 24 units, the whole thing counts because it's a rental development. So if we added a number of units to Woodhaven, it would all count towards our goal. And the same thing with Leland Farms. We determined the number of units with Leland Farms basically on the basis of how much money could we, it's based on finances, how much was it going to cost to build, how much we need to borrow, what kind of grant do we have, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the market rate number kept going up because we needed more money.
Right, I understand that, but now if we added like 3 units to Leland Farms, we'd be able to sell the condos and get the money back, so it'd be a short-term borrower, so on and so on. And one of them be affordable, 2 of them be affordable. While it's not big numbers, it addresses the problem, it builds where they should be, and it capitalizes on successes, rather than trying to go off someplace and have to deal with lack of infrastructure, lack of everything.
Isn't Leyland Farms all affordable?
No.
Oh, it's not.
No, it is condo, it's owned ownership, so you'd have to figure out how to get land out of the condo to create new units.
But even yes, Leland will, all of Woodhaven counts.
Well, in terms of
The other, is like, since you are still there, the Community Preservation Act, I guess the reason we didn't, we started going and looking into it, and then it seems like with Boston adopting it, there was less funding, and it had been, and with our town currently fighting high taxes,
it's another tax.
It's a non-starter, I think it really is at this point. If we could get more development in town and bring the tax base up and bring the tax rate down, it makes a lot more sense.
The other issue is the one that Paul raised, which is the town is just much more comfortable voting and funding a specific project rather than taxing yourself in advance for an unknown fund for a board. That was...
So Chuck, could the town vote for getting matching money? The part we're missing is, we're paying taxes for other communities to get a matching grant. When we fund it ourselves, we're not getting it. It's 15%.
Right. But if our taxes are 23+%, it's hard to say add another 1 or 2%.
You guys just gotta figure out where to get the tax. We want to add this tax, the CPA tax. You guys gotta figure out how to make it work.
That sounds really familiar.
You guys have to sell it, and if you sell it to the voters, we'll be happy to help spend it. But I think...
Wait a minute.
Well,
yes,
I think we covered from a deliberation point of view, I don't feel comfortable we can make all the edits to approve the plan tonight.
So we have an executive session on June 1st, but I would propose that we add this as a discussion ahead of the executive session, and if it makes sense to have a joint meeting and you want to do it, that's fine. We do have a couple of things to take care of in executive session, and I don't quite know how those have been scheduled yet, but I think if others want to, I would add it to the June 1st agenda for discussion.
Sure.
That sounds fair, I mean, because we can send edits, there's edits such as the language ahead to Jennifer, so that's something.
I got a bunch of proofreading edits that I want to show her too, but, just little things that would clear it up in some ways, but not substantive enough to bother stuff talking about.
Well, she found some herself as she was reading it. She said, oh, well, the word housing should have been before the word development. So even as she was reading it, she was spotting things.
The idea that it was pulled together this quickly, you're
Since
doing a
December.
great job.
It's astonishing.
There was a general
surprising that
statement
we did.
that was made that, there's a general statement that was made that I already kind of called it out, but it's still in there. And I think we need to just take a look at it. She showed it tonight on the board. It was looking at the yin and yang of town center versus periphery for new development, or new development, or development in general. And in the first place, she states, she says, while others feel just as strongly after coming back to the center, Huddersfield.
What page are you on, Diane?
Pardon me?
What page are you reading from?
Page six.
Slide with the diversion.
Diversion.
Yeah, page 6. Sorry.
Chuck, you got it.
So it's about new growth in town center, it's in a paragraph.
Isn't the second paragraph?
Second paragraph on page 6.
The scribble?
Yeah, that's it. So while others feel just as strongly that new growth, if it happens at all, should be located on the periphery of town and possibly access neighboring towns and districts. I think she's reporting the feelings of the town here. And my impression of everything I've heard from the town so far is that bringing in infrastructure from adjacent towns would be fine. It's a 40B development like Coolidge Crossing. That's the specific one that this came up about. But for new growth in general,
Yeah, that's a good point. It's too vaguely
I'm not
worded.
sure. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's very dangerous.
I think it's too vaguely worded.
Yeah.
You've picked up on it. It's great. It's really good.
So
That
we
should
could
be
say,
refined.
we did add, well, it would have to be, town approved, selected developments, but in this general statement, I'm not comfortable.
So would you add after the word "and," say something like "and pertaining particularly to affordable housing," or if it includes affordable housing, possibly access neighboring towns infrastructure, something that ties that to affordable housing?
Yeah, well, the way this came up, of course, is that in fact, affordable housing, 40B proposals are pretty much on the periphery of the town, including Coolidge Crossing. And they probably many of them have water sewer problems, but Coolidge Crossing in particular. So others feel just as strongly that,
Or would you see new growth that is denser than single-family housing?
no, that's still just too general.
Too general.
New growth that, new growth that is denser variety and the goal is we wouldn't want to limit it to 40B because we'd like as a town to have more local initiative or local action type of development in which we have a measure of control, and it may not fall under the specifics of 40B, but it will look different than other developments under our current bylaws. So
Marion, is the goal to limit to qualify the access to neighboring towns' infrastructure to affordable housing? Because if it is, what Mike suggested, I think, takes care of that. Limit it to and for affordable housing, possibly access.
Well, to be located on the periphery of town, we could solve the problem by simply crossing out and possibly access neighboring towns' infrastructure.
Marion, I think you're right. This is a very general thing, and the last part of it is very specific. You can take it right out.
Yeah, just end the sentence on the periphery of town. The real...
Well, but that plays into the action item, right, of working to access neighboring towns' water and sewer infrastructure for affordable housing.
Action Plan 5.
Yeah, it's also referencing how two different groups in town feel. It's a divergent perception of things. It's not saying one way or the other what the strategy is. It's really reporting.
That's right, but how the town, I think, what I see and read feels is, town centers have been placed for new development, or perhaps on the periphery of the town near commuters and, town center.
Well, so Marion, I think that there's two things going on. If you're talking about affordable housing and how do we solve our mandate requirement, I think there's a tension between people who say put it in the center of town and people who say put it on the periphery and maybe run water and sewer. If you're talking about development in general, I think it's a tension between people who say don't develop and people who say if you have to develop in the center of town. I don't think we have anybody who's saying for development in general, let's develop, but let's put it at the edge of the town. That's in the context of meeting our 40B mandate. People don't want development. They feel forced into development.
That's right. It's really in the context of 40B.
Yeah.
That's it. It's not in general.
So it should say, just as strongly that new affordable housing related growth, if it happens at all?
Something like that.
Yeah, that new dense affordable housing developments should be located on.
I think if you put the word dense in there, it's going to make people think that you're
Yeah.
talking
Right.
about the projects, which
Yeah.
we couldn't even get the PUD bylaw,
That's a level of
or the
detail.
cluster housing
Right.
Yeah.
bylaw through, because people thought that meant, apartments and dense condos and stuff.
Yeah.
So just as strongly that affordable housing related growth, if it happens at all.
How are we going to coordinate the wordsmithing? We're looking at this on June 1st. Jennifer, I thought, made a good point on the action plan for this item, item 5. I would flip Board of Selectmen as the primary responsibility and town administrators implementing it. Marianne, you made a great point on item 10.
The only problem with that
Sliding it over. Well, we need to, like,
the other problem with that is the Board of Selectmen's not the one that's out there talking with Natick, right, or not the one that's out there talking with Ashland or Framingham, because
we are in terms of negotiating the intermunicipal
through
agreement.
staff. We would do it through staff, right?
Yeah,
So you were saying we're primary because we direct.
and have to approve it. But
So Chuck, you're looking at page
But I'm also,
24.
the real question is focused on process. You guys are wordsmithing, we're going to be wordsmithing, how do we coordinate so that we have one approved plan?
Right.
When will you guys be done with your wordsmithing?
Way before you.
Then
Well,
we
this
just send-
this last little bit.
They just
I did-
finished it.
They're done?
Yeah, thanks.
Nothing, I mean, but we want to agree on the concept before we.
Sure.
Agree on the words.
June 1st is next Thursday.
That's right.
We have a regular meeting on June 6th, I think, and we have a Friday meeting.
Right.
We have a meeting tomorrow, which includes the general plan and housing.
Right, I mean, we could do this.
Yeah, I mean, you've done such great work in such a short amount of time, I'd hate to lose weeks
Yeah.
on this small piece.
So, we can, but you guys have a meeting on June 1st.
We have a meeting on June 1st, which is already scheduled, and we can put this on the agenda.
Jennifer's not paying attention, so.
No, I am looking for my schedule.
She's trying to find out if she has it.
Well, let's agree quickly before she finds her schedule.
And let's make sure we give the credit not to the planning board, but the housing partnership who drafted this.
Yeah, well, I guess that's true.
It is, it's a good overlap. I'm expanding the credit to the housing partnership committee, which has done a great job.
That's very cool.
You'll be allowed
No
to-
conflict.
Exactly.
You mean it wasn't correct?
Keep that up, I'll vote for you. Could be eviction.
Go the other direction.
Okay, so,
May I ask,
yeah,
any of the edits that the selectmen want, can we get them to Gino so we can have them and really discuss them tomorrow? I'm not going to be able to make Thursday, I have a graduation.
it's about time, congratulations, Brendan. Yeah, that's a great request. You guys said everything you can.
Just forward to Gino and we can look at it tomorrow.
We're gonna forward it by, hopefully by midnight.
Well, I hope there's not 80 of them.
Well, but I'd say,
We need some
copy me as well, so we can have it tomorrow. All right,
I'm at that graduation, so
anything else?
Well, is there a majority of us that can meet on, with them on the 1st?
On the first?
That would be great.
Sarah, you
Actually, be there.
Wrap this up.
Continue this discussion.
Yeah.
Give a new
Hopefully
draft.
wrap up the discussion.
No, I meant, did you get one? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Is there a timeline?
Thank you.
A deadline on the business plan?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
As soon as possible, though, right? I mean, the whole idea is to get this thing in.
Want to make sure you have one.
There isn't anything that says it has to be done by July 1 or it doesn't count for another year or anything like that.
We've had a June 15th date. You know, Addie has advised us, and that's one reason this was scheduled when it is. I don't think we're going to have a lot of changes, to be honest with you.
I don't either.
I've sent my changes to
Yeah.
We're
January, so
talking about having
there's not going to be any more tonight.
selectmen to find
But it'll give us time to, we'll all reflect, these guys will meet tomorrow, they may come up with other brilliant ideas. And,
Can happen.
I'm sure.
We'll get that
I
vote.
expect it to.
Now the pressure. So I can make June 1st.
Approximately what time, 6
Um,
or 7?
I think probably, well, it's the Mark, it started at 6 on the first of June, maybe?
I can't.
So we'd be down to 3 board members, so if we started at 7, we could do it, or we could start at 6:30 without Mark, or is it?
And I said we did 7.
We'd be there at 7, okay.
Is that tonight?
Let's start at 7. All right, we'll move around the executive session piece of it.
Just you can't get the boss to here at 5 and stuff. It took me 2 hours. If the meeting is at 5, I can travel between 3 and 5. Or if it's at 9 o'clock, I can do it.
There's a pretty direct correlation between the growth in towns and their proximity to commuter rail. Ashland, Natick.
So can I just clarify, are you thinking of doing another joint meeting on the 1st?
I don't think it's going to be a big
Yeah.
panel discussion, it's more a sense to share ideas and submit whatever we've got, hopefully at the end of that meeting or
Come
shortly
up
afterwards.
with one set of changes.
Okay, so after that, you'd submit the changes, and then would you approve it subject to those changes, or would you then meet again and
I
approve
think
it
that'd be
after?
the best thing to do, if we approve it subject to changes, yeah.
Yeah,
that'd
okay.
be Fantastic. And maybe we could funnel the changes through Gino or somebody, so we've got one, sort of scribe who can collect them for you, and
That would be great,
I just
yeah.
think it's probably works better for you and for all of us that way. Is that right?
Is it possible to get the current final draft in a Word doc format?
Yeah, don't you have it already?
We have the earlier draft. We have
Oh, the
earlier-
latest version? Okay, yeah, of course.
Is that the one on the town website? Word doc?
No, PDF.
Oh, it is a PDF.
Okay. Anything
I didn't
else?
say why.
We need to adjourn, the motion to adjourn the planning board meeting.
Second.
Further discussion? See you tomorrow.
All right, motion to adjourn.
Or adjourn.
Second?
I was asking. You all right? You move second? Yeah. Before we adjourn?
I had sent a memo around about wanting to put on some
All in
agenda.
favor?
All those in
Motion.
Oh.